In 12th century India, the Anubhava Mantapa functioned as an open university where spiritual claims faced merciless public scrutiny. Mystics and philosophers gathered here to defend their internal realizations before a tribunal of their peers. Surviving from these debates is an artifact known as Vachana 337, composed by the mystic Akka Mahadevi. The text opens with an observation of the natural world. Pearl became water. Hailstone became water. Salt became water. Salt melted. Hailstone melted. Has anyone seen the pearl melt? She then pivots to a direct critique of her audience. These worldly humans touched the linga and became burdened. I touched you, O Lord Chenamallikarjuna, and solidified. Vachana 337 functions as a rigorous epistemological proof. Akka Mahadevi used this logic to establish her spiritual authority and absolute independence within a skeptical, patriarchal assembly. The text relies on a badagu, a poetic riddle built on a physical paradox. 3 objects originate in water, yet when they return to that source, only 2 dissolve while 1 remains intact. In Lingayat philosophy, water represents the linga, the absolute, formless divine void from which all existence emerges. When a human consciousness makes contact with this infinite void, it triggers a phenomenon modern psychology calls ego death, the annihilation of the subjective self. This raises the central investigative question: this ultimate spiritual contact require the complete erasure of human identity? Akka Mahadevi argues that ultimate surrender results in a transformation. The seeker enters an indestructible state of awareness, maintaining presence even within the infinite. To prove her theory, she begins with the mechanics of salt. Salt represents worldly attachment. It is formed by its environment and lacks the structural integrity to survive immersion back into its source. She then introduces the hailstone, or Vardikalu. The hailstone embodies transient human emotion and the fragile ego. It is a temporary, frozen state that shatters or liquefies when subjected to external pressure. Finally, she presents the pearl, the mutu. In the lexicon of the Sharana mystics, the pearl signifies arivu. This is awakened, ripened consciousness that has been forged through the intense pressure of inner discipline. This diagram shows how these distinct states of being react when they make contact with the absolute. Upon entering the void, the ego and worldly attachments disintegrate. They return to the environment, losing all individual form. But the awakened consciousness survives the immersion. It exists within the infinite without losing its structural integrity. The conclusion is precise. Origin does not dictate destiny. Though all 3 objects were born of the physical world, only the consciousness forged by pressure survives contact with the infinite. Akka Mahadevi embeds this logic into the acoustics of her poem using phonosemantics, the study of how the physical sound of words conveys their meaning. Consider the auditory structure of the Old Kannada word for melted, karagitu. This spectrogram maps the word karagitu. The soft vowels and rolling fricatives physically relax the speaker's mouth, mimicking the physical sensation of liquefaction. Compare this with her final declaration at the end of the poem, karigonde, meaning solidified or crystallized. This spectrogram of karigonde displays a different architecture. The hard consonants force the mouth to halt sharply, creating an unbreakable acoustic barrier. The architecture of her poetry reflects the transition between spiritual collapse and spiritual hardening. In the 3rd line, she addresses the samsari, the worldly humans or superficial devotees. These superficial devotees participate in grand ritual and physically touch the linga, yet they completely fail to achieve spiritual liberation. They pursue rasananda, a fleeting emotional high that ordinary observers mistake for enlightenment. This emotional high is temporary. True realization requires a permanent internal transformation. Because they avoid this transformation, Akka labels them bhavabari. Bhavabari describes the accumulation of worldly burden. By touching the divine with an unprepared ego, they increase their karmic weight, sinking further into the gravity of their own illusions. Proximity to the divine does not inherently liberate. Without inner transformation, the seeker remains trapped in the cycle of worldly existence. The physical stakes of this defense were extreme. Akka Mahadevi stood as a naked female ascetic before a tribunal of elite male philosophers. Her critics viewed her rejection of social norms as evidence of delusion, demanding a justification for her state. Her defense relied on the Shot-Stella philosophy, a six-stage progression of spiritual evolution culminating in Aikya-Stella. This final stage triggers Linganga Samarasya, the moment the human body, or Anga, merges with the divine Linga without losing its distinct point of consciousness. Her claim is Karigonde, I solidified. By asserting this state, she establishes a consciousness that is immune to external judgment or physical degradation. This assertion subverts patriarchal kinship norms. She bypasses mortal hierarchies to claim an unyielding union with the infinite. Through solidification, she proves that while societal rules and fragile egos dissolve like hail, her transpersonal self remains completely indestructible. This 12th century framework aligns with contemporary observations of mystical states. The melting of salt and hail mirrors ego dissolution, a state achieved when the brain's default mode network, which maintains our sense of self, reduces its activity. The crystallized pearl corresponds to the transpersonal self, a sense of identity that remains stable after the subjective ego has dissolved. It is the profound experience of a razor-sharp boundary of awareness existing within an infinite egoless field. Using the vocabulary of nature, Akka Mahadevi detailed a phenomenological progression that echoes the neurological shifts documented in ego death. This comparative matrix places her model alongside other global mystical traditions, demonstrating the consistency of her claims. The melting of salt aligns with the Sufi concept of fana, the annihilation of the ego in the presence of the divine. The crystallizing pearl matches the ka, the state of eternal subsistence, where the seeker retains awareness within the infinite. In Zen Buddhism, Satori leads to sunyata, or pure emptiness. Akka Mahadevi identifies this stabilized union as Linganga Samarasya. Her articulation is distinct for its radical accessibility. She used the everyday language of laborers, water, salt, and hail, to describe the highest mysteries of consciousness. Spiritual surrender is often perceived as an act of passive disappearance. Vachana 337 argues that touching the infinite is an act of becoming. The seeker emerges as an indestructible awakened entity within the divine void.